Imagine walking into this massive, very formal courtroom. You know the environment before you even step through the doors. Right?
Oh, yeah. The heavy wooden benches.
Yeah, the polished benches, the marble floors echoing with every step you take, and the roles of every single person in that room are just completely assigned.
It's all very structured.
Very structured. You have the prosecution at one table, you've got the defense at the other, a gallery full of spectators, and then elevated above everyone else is the judge holding the gavel.
Right.
And you walk into this room, the gavel falls, and everyone knows their place. The lines between right and wrong, between guilty and innocent, they just seem incredibly clear.
You'd think so, yeah.
But then you step into the world of historical theology, and specifically the text we are going to look at today, and suddenly that entire courtroom gets turned upside down.
It's a complete role reversal.
Right. The person sitting high up on the bench, the one, banging the gavel and passing sentences on everyone else, they look down at their wrists and realize they're actually the one wearing handcuffs.
Yeah.
They're the one on trial. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking. You are about to look at one of the most debated chapters in biblical literature, and we are going to extract the core insights from these translation notes together. Our mission today is an extensive investigation of the Net Bible First Edition notes on Romans chapter 2.
And that courtroom analogy you just used, that sets up the precise friction we are going to encounter today.
It's intense, right?
Oh, incredibly intense. Because Romans chapter 2, it contains some highly unusual difficulties for anyone trying to interpret it. I mean, we are looking at a text where the author, the Apostle Paul, is aggressively leveling the playing field between completely different groups of people.
He's just tearing down the walls.
Yeah, tearing them down. He is systematically stripping away outward religious confidence. He's tearing down those elevated judges' benches you mentioned, and he's focusing entirely on the internal hidden state of the human heart.
Wow.
And the way he goes about this is so radical, so rhetorically violent, really, that it has caused massive disagreements among academics for centuries.
Well, and we really need to frame the sheer scale of that disagreement before we look at the specific words of the text.
Definitely.
Because looking at the very first note in our source material, it feels like walking into an academic crossfire. You have all these brilliant minds looking at the same document and coming away with wildly different conclusions.
Totally different.
So instead of just listing off the different views one by one, can we group them together? Like when scholars look at the arguments in this chapter, what are the main camps they fall into?
Yeah, that is the best way to approach it, because otherwise the sheer volume of academic opinion can feel pretty overwhelming. So when you synthesize the translation notes, the scholars generally fall into two broad camps regarding what Paul is actually doing here.
Okay.
The first camp essentially concludes that the author is confused, or at least highly inconsistent.
Wait, really?
Confused? Yeah. This is often called the critical approach.
Yeah.
The notes mention scholars like E.P. Sanders and H. Reisanen as prime examples of this view. They argue that the arguments Paul makes in this chapter just cannot be harmonized with the things he writes in his other letters.
Man, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that.
How so?
Well, if I'm sitting down to read a historical document and the leading experts tell me the author is just contradicting himself, my immediate reaction is to ask why I should even bother reading it.
Right.
How do they justify the idea that someone as educated as Paul would just lose his train of thought in the middle of his flagship letter?
Well, the critical scholars argue it comes down to his sources. They suggest Paul is drawing heavily from what is called Diaspora Judaism.
Okay, what is that?
This refers to the Jewish communities living outside of Israel, scattered throughout the Greco-Roman world. And these communities, they had their own specific ways of talking about the law, morality, and judgment, often influenced by the surrounding Greek culture.
Got it.
So Sanders and Reisanen, they argue that Paul essentially copied and pasted arguments from that specific cultural context into his letter to the Romans. And he did it in a way that creates an outright contradiction with his own theology of grace. In their view, he is using borrowed material that just doesn't fit his own framework.
So they see it as like a sloppy editing job.
Pretty much, yeah.
He grabbed a sermon illustration from the synagogue down the street, threw it into his letter, and didn't realize it contradicted his main point.
That's the argument.
But obviously that is not the only way to read the text, because if we assume the author is not confused, we end up in the second major camp of scholars, right?
Spot on. The second broad camp just refuses to accept that Paul is being sloppy. Instead, they argue he is employing a highly sophisticated rhetorical strategy. Now, The notes outline several variations of this, but the most fascinating one is the idea that Paul is setting up a brilliant hypothetical situation.
A hypothetical.
Yeah, we will dig into the mechanics of this later, but the basic premise is that Paul builds a hypothetical standard of perfect obedience. He says that if anyone could theoretically obey the rules flawlessly, they would be justified.
Okay.
But the unspoken punchline, the trapdoor he is waiting to pull, is that in reality, no human being actually can.
That makes so much more sense to me,
Right.
especially as someone who approaches this text from a Reformed theological perspective,
Yeah.
where we hold very strongly to concepts like total depravity, and the inability of humans to save themselves. The idea that this is a rhetorical trap fits perfectly.
It really does.
It's not a contradiction, it's a setup.
Yeah.
But the notes also mention some scholars who think Paul is talking about very specific, literal groups of people, don't they?
True.
It's not just about a hypothetical trap for everyone.
Correct. Within this discussion, there are scholars trying to pin down a very specific audience. The notes list a view where the Gentiles mentioned doing the law are not just random people, but specifically Gentile Christians who have the Holy Spirit.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And there's another view arguing this chapter is only concerning the future judgment of Christians. And they link this to other verses like Romans 14.10 and 2 Corinthians 5.10, which talk about believers standing before a judgment seat.
Okay.
And then there is a very specific view proposed by a scholar named A. Ito.
What is Ito's angle on this?
So Ito suggests that the background for this entire chapter is found in the Old Testament, specifically the list of blessings and curses in Deuteronomy chapters 27 through 30.
Okay, so going way back.
Right. In Ito's reading, the intense condemnation we see later in Romans 2 is specifically addressing the historical failure of the Jewish nation as a whole to keep the covenant. It is less about individual hypothetical morality and more about a massive national indictment based on the ancient texts.
Okay, so we have the inconsistency camp, we have the rhetorical trap camp, and we have the specific audience camp.
Yeah, that's a good summary.
But I want to zero in on this idea of the rhetorical trap, because the anatomy of how this chapter is built is absolutely fascinating.
It really is.
And the trigger for this trap seems to be the very first word in chapter 2. In English, it is translated as therefore, and the notes tell us the Greek word is dio.
Right, dio.
This inferential word, it just pulls the reader directly into the crosshairs.
The placement of that single word, dio, is a masterclass in psychological tension. To understand why it works, you have to look at the structural observation made by interpreter C.K. Barrett, which the notes highlight here.
What does Barrett say?
Barrett connects this therefore all the way back to Romans 1.32a. He treats the entire second half of chapter 1, verse 32, as a parenthetical comment.
Let's give the listener the context of what is happening at the end of chapter 1, because Paul just spent a massive amount of ink building a towering indictment of human unrighteousness.
Oh yeah, a huge list.
He lists out all these terrible behaviors: greed, envy, murder, deceit, malice, gossips, slanderers. If you are a moral, upstanding person living in the first century, you are reading that list and nodding along.
Oh, absolutely.
And we're saying, yes, those pagans out there are ruining society. Give it to them, Paul.
Yeah.
You were sitting very comfortably in the judge's seat.
And that is exactly when, well, that is precisely when the trap springs shut. You are nodding along with the condemnation of all those obvious sinners, and then Paul pivots on a dime.
Right.
He writes, therefore you are without excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. He takes the spotlight that was shining on the chaotic pagan world and snaps it directly into the eyes of the moralizing reader. The translation notes point out that the Greek expands this concept to mean you have nothing to say in your own defense.
Man, the phrase, oh man, is incredibly confrontational.
It is.
It's not a polite transition. It's the rhetorical equivalent of pointing a finger directly at someone's chest.
Yeah.
You think you are the judge, but suddenly you are the one on trial. And the logic Paul uses to trap the judge is devastating. In verse 3, the text says, and do you think this, oh man, the one who judges those who do such things and do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God?
Yeah.
He is calling out the fundamental hypocrisy of human nature. We always judge others by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions.
The psychology of it is brilliant and terrifying. Paul knows that the person judging others assumes their position of judgment makes them safe.
Right.
And verse 4 targets another massive assumption this kind of person makes. The text asks if they despise the riches of God's kindness, being unaware that God's kindness leads to repentance.
I love that phrase, being unaware. The literal translation of the Greek really captures the blindness of the moralist.
It does.
They look at their life, they see that lightning hasn't struck them down, they see that they have a decent job and a nice house, and they assume God's patience is a stamp of approval. They think, I must be doing something right because God has not judged me.
They misinterpret a delay in the trial as an acquittal, but the text aggressively dismantles that assumption. Verse 5 introduces a terrifying piece of imagery to explain what is actually happening during that delay. It says, "But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself." The Greek word for stubbornness there is literally hardness.
I want to dig into that concept of a hard heart, because for a first-century audience, especially a Jewish listener, that phrase is not just a metaphor for being a little stubborn. It carries massive historical and theological weight.
Oh, for sure.
And notes link this directly to some heavy Old Testament imagery.
They do, and we really have to understand that context to feel the impact of the accusation. The translation notes direct us to Jeremiah 4.4 and Ezekiel 3.7.
What happens in those passages?
In both of those prophetic books, the prophets are dealing with a nation that has completely stopped listening to God. Ezekiel specifically describes the people as having an obstinate forehead and a hard heart.
Ouch.
It means the tissue has calcified, the person is impervious to conviction, you can show them their own hypocrisy, and it just bounces off.
And the notes also reference an extra biblical text here, which is really interesting. They bring up 1 Enoch 16.3.
Yes, so 1 Enoch is an ancient Jewish apocalyptic text. It was not considered part of the canonical scriptures, but it was widely read and highly influential in the cultural imagination of the first century.
Okay.
The fact that the translation notes reference 1 Enoch shows us just how prevalent this specific imagery of a hard heart was. It was the cultural bogeyman. To be accused of having a hard heart was the ultimate indictment, because a hard heart cannot be reasoned with.
And the consequence of this hard heart is that the person is storing up wrath. I picture this like a bank account.
It's a good way to look at it.
Right. Every time you point the finger at someone else while doing the same thing in secret, every time you assume God's patience is a license to keep sinning, you are making a deposit into this account of wrath.
Yeah, accumulating it.
You think you are building a retirement fund of good deeds, but you are actually compounding your own guilt. And the text says this account will be opened on the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God.
Which naturally forces a terrifying question onto the reader. If this delay in judgment is going to end, and a day of righteous judgment is coming, what is the standard going to be?
Right.
When the gavel finally falls, what rules are going to be applied in that courtroom?
And that leads us to Romans 2.6 through 10, which contains a standard of judgment that has caused immense friction for theologians.
Oh yes, a ton of friction.
It is arguably the most debated hypothetical standard in all of our source material, because the text states the standard plainly. God will render or will recompense to each person according to their works.
The notes mention this is a quotation drawn from the Old Testament, specifically Psalm 62.1 and Proverbs 24.1. It is also a very close approximation to the words Jesus uses in Matthew 16.27. The standard is universal and unambiguous. Judgment will be according to human works.
I have to stop right here, because as someone who leans heavily into Reformed theology, reading this verse usually gives me a mild panic attack.
I can imagine.
Right, because the entire foundation of the Protestant Reformation is the concept of justification by faith alone. We are saved by grace, not by our works, because our works are hopelessly flawed.
Right.
But here, in the middle of a letter that is famous for defending grace, Paul explicitly says God will give eternal life to those who do good works and wrath to those who do evil. This sounds like a pure covenant of works. It sounds like he is saying you can earn your way into heaven if your resume is good enough.
And that tension is why Note 15 in our source material is so critical. This is where the brilliant rhetorical strategy of the hypothetical scenario comes into play.
Okay, unpack that.
The note explicitly clarifies that in this context, Paul is setting up a hypothetical situation. He is not stating that salvation is actually achieved by works.
I need to push back on that, just playing the skeptic for a moment.
Sure.
Why would an author spend so much time establishing a rule, rendering to everyone according to their works, promising eternal life to those who patiently do good, promising suffering and distress on every soul who does evil, Jew first and also Greek, if it is purely hypothetical?
I hear you.
Does that not run the risk of massively confusing his audience? Is he just building a straw man argument?
It might look like a straw man from a distance, but when you examine the mechanics of what he is doing, it is actually a devastating psychological tactic.
How so?
Think about the audience Paul is targeting. He is addressing people who believe their ethnic background, their religious heritage, or their theological knowledge protects them from judgment.
Yeah.
They think they have a VIP pass that lets them bypass the standard line. By stating a universal standard of perfect obedience, judging purely by works, Paul completely removes any ethnic or religious advantage.
I see. It is like setting a high jump bar at 100 feet in the air.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
It does not matter if you are an Olympic gold medalist in track and field or someone who hasn't left their couch in a decade. A bar set at 100 feet levels the playing field completely because absolutely everyone fails to clear it. By setting the standard at flawless behavioral perfection, your background, your heritage, and your knowledge do not matter at all.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. And look at the specific contrasts he draws to prove this point. In verse 8, he talks about those who act from selfish ambition and who disobey the truth.
Yeah.
The notes point out a nuance here. The Greek literally says, those who are from selfish ambition. It describes their core character, not just a momentary lapse.
Wow.
Then in verse 9, the text says there will be suffering and distress on everyone who does evil. The literal Greek phrase highlighted in the notes is every soul of man. There are no exceptions.
The hypothetical standard acts as an unavoidable mirror. It forces the reader to evaluate their own actions without the comfort of their religious safety net. The underlying point is that under a strict standard of perfect works, everyone fails. The Olympic athlete and the couch potato both hit the dirt.
And the text makes a massive point to emphasize the absolute universality of the standard. It says Jew first and also Greek, and then repeats it in verse 10. Glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek.
Okay.
The notes specify that Paul uses the term Greek here in a broad sense to refer to all non-Jews, meaning the Gentiles. It is a total leveling of the human race before the bench.
But that leveling effect sets up the next massive logical hurdle in the text.
What's that?
If God is judging everyone according to their works, what is the measuring stick being used to evaluate those works? What defines a good work versus an evil work?
Right.
This brings us to verse 12 and the introduction of a word that is going to dominate the entire rest of the discussion.
The word is law. Verse 12 says, for all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law.
And the notes point out a highly significant fact here.
Yeah.
This is the very first occurrence of the word law in the entire book of Romans.
Right. The Greek word is nomos.
And this introduces a massive layer of friction because if you don't define which law you are talking about, the entire argument collapses into confusion.
It certainly does, and the exact meaning of nomos in Paul's writings has been the subject of exhausting scholarly debate. To help us cut through the noise, the translation notes bring in the work of a scholar named J.A. Fitzmyer.
Okay.
Fitzmyer provides a framework by outlining 4 different senses of the word law as it is used by Paul across his letters.
Let's walk through those 4 senses because I think a lot of readers just assume law means the 10 Commandments and move on.
Yeah, that's common.
But understanding the specific definition changes the entire weight of Paul's rhetorical trap.
So Fitzmyer's first category is a figurative use, where law just means a general guiding principle. For example, someone might say they are bound by the law of gravity or the law of supply and demand.
Okay, that makes sense.
The second category is generic, meaning a law in a broad sense, like a local civil rule or a societal custom.
Like jaywalking.
Exactly. Well, right, like jaywalking.
Yeah.
The third category refers to the Old Testament as a whole collection of writings. And the fourth category is a specific, targeted reference to the Mosaic law.
I would compare this to modern conversations about the Constitution.
How so?
If you and I are arguing, and I say that action violates the Constitution, you need to know which definition I am using. If I am talking about the specific United States Constitution, that carries massive legal weight and federal consequences.
Huge consequences.
But if we were members of a local neighborhood chess club, and I mean the general constitution of that club, the weight is entirely different. The consequence is just getting kicked out of the club.
That's a great point.
Or, I might use the word figuratively, saying a person has a strong physical constitution, meaning their immune system is robust. The specific definition determines the reality of the situation.
That is a perfect parallel, and the notes are very clear on how we should apply Fitzmyer's categories to this specific chapter.
Which one is it?
They state that the fourth usage, a specific reference to the Mosaic law, constitutes the vast majority of Paul's references to law in the book of Romans. The notes on verse 17 later clarified that this Mosaic law is described mainly in the Old Testament books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
So we are not talking about a general principle of being a nice person.
No, not at all.
When verse 13 says, "For not the hearers of the law are righteous before God, but the doers of the law will be declared righteous," it is talking about the specific written commands given to the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai.
Yes. And the notes mention the Greek expresses this contrast more succinctly than English can, literally saying, not the hearers, but the doers.
So the focus is on rigorous, practical adherence to the written code. But this immediately creates a massive complication for the hypothetical trap Paul has built. This leads us right into Romans 2.13 through 16. If the specific written Mosaic law is the standard of judgment in this courtroom, what happens to the Gentiles?
Right, the non-Jews.
Exactly. I mean, they were never given the books of Exodus or Leviticus. They were not at Mount Sinai. How can a righteous God judge a massive portion of the human race by a set of written rules they literally never received?
It sounds like an unfair trial.
It does. It sounds like prosecuting someone for breaking a traffic law that was never written down or posted on a sign.
Yeah.
But verse 14 addresses this supposed loophole head-on. It introduces the concept of Gentiles who, by nature, do things of the law. Now, the notes mention that Gentile is just the New Testament term for a non-Jew, but the phrase by nature introduces a really fascinating grammatical and theological nuance.
It really does. The Greek phrase there is phusei, which translates to by nature. The translation notes cite the scholar C.E.B. Cranfield, who makes a brilliant grammatical observation that flips the common reading on its head.
What's his observation?
Well, most people read the verse like this. The Gentiles do the things of the law by nature, meaning they just naturally act like good people.
Okay, sure.
But Cranfield suggests the phrase phusei might actually modify the preceding clause, which is do not have the law.
I want to make sure I'm following this. What does it mean to not have the law by nature?
If Cranfield is right, the text would read, the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature. In other words, they lack the written scrolls simply by virtue of not being born into the Jewish nation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. By their birth nature, their physical lineage, they are outside the covenant community that received the physical text.
That is a massive shift in meaning. It takes the focus off of their natural goodness and puts the focus on their natural exclusion from the physical scroll.
Bon.
But regardless of which way you read the grammar of phusei, the end result described in the text is the same. They still show the work of the law to be written in them. The notes mention that the words to be are implied by the Greek construction. But the really gripping part of this section is the internal courtroom described in verse 15. It says their conscience bears witness, and their thoughts act as lawyers, either accusing or defending them.
The literal reading of the Greek, according to the notes, is their conscience bearing witness and between the thoughts accusing or also defending one another.
Man, it's such a vivid psychological picture.
It is. Paul is saying that even without the physical written scrolls of Exodus or Leviticus, there is a rigorous moral accounting happening inside the human mind at all times.
Everyone listening to this has experienced that internal courtroom.
Oh, daily.
Right. You do something you know it's questionable, and instantly a trial begins in your head. Your conscience is the witness on the stand saying you lied about that. Then your thoughts split into two legal teams.
Yeah.
The prosecuting attorney says you are a liar and a fraud. The defense attorney jumps up and says, objection. It was just a white lie to protect someone's feelings. And besides, everyone else does it.
Right, the rationalization.
The rationalization, the guilt, the self-deception, it is an endless legal battle happening between your own ears.
And Paul's point is that the existence of this internal courtroom proves that the Gentiles are not ignorant of God's moral requirements.
The work of the law is written on their hearts.
Yes, they know the difference between right and wrong, even if they don't have the specific cultural rule book. And all of this internal accounting, all of these prosecuting and defending thoughts, they are building toward a specific climactic future event.
Verse 16 says this all culminates on the day when God will judge the secrets of human hearts.
The notes clarify that the Greek word for judge here could be present or future in form, but it is best translated in the future because the context is clearly pointing to a coming final judgment.
Right. The internal courtroom is just a shadow of the final courtroom. And notice the standard God uses for this ultimate judgment of hidden secrets. Paul says it is according to my gospel.
And the notes reference Romans 16.25 and 6 Timothy 2.8 to show that this phrase, my gospel, is a specific recurring formulation Paul uses to describe the message he preaches.
Let's summarize the trap so far, because the logic is airtight.
Go for it.
We have the hypothetical standard of perfect works, a bar set so high no one can clear it. The Gentiles, who do not have the written law, try to claim ignorance, but Paul points to their own internal conscience to prove they know they're failing a moral standard. So the Gentile is trapped.
Completely trapped. But
this brings us to the most brutal pivot in the entire text, starting in verse 17. What about the listener who actually has the written text of the Mosaic law in their hands? What about the person who feels completely secure?
This is the moment the trap that was set back in verse 1 completely springs shut on the primary target. In Romans 2.17 through 24, the focus shifts directly and aggressively to the Jewish listener.
Yes, let's look at it.
Verse 17 starts the confrontation. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God, and the notes suggest this phrase, boast in God, is likely an allusion to Jeremiah 9.24.
Which talks about boasting not in human wisdom or human strength, but in knowing the Lord.
Yeah.
Right. The text then builds this towering list of external religious privileges.
Yeah.
It says, you know his will, you approve what is excellent because you are instructed out of the law. You are convinced you are a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth.
It's quite a list.
It is a resume of absolute religious supremacy.
And from a grammatical standpoint, the notes point out that verse 19 shares the conditional meaning of the earlier verses, even though the word if is not explicitly repeated in the Greek.
Oh, I see.
It is a long, continuous buildup of conditional statements. If you have all these privileges, if you know the will, if you are a guide.
It builds this massive tension, waiting for the then statement. But when we hit verses 21 through 24, the structure of the text itself seems to buckle and collapse under the weight of the accusation.
It really does.
The notes spend a significant amount of time highlighting the structural difficulty of this section.
They do, because note 41 points out that the structure of verses 21 through 24 is notoriously difficult in the original Greek.
How so?
The grammar is fractured. The notes explain there are two main ways scholars try to handle this breakdown. The first way is to try and smooth it out by seeing these verses as the conclusion, the apodosis, in grammatical terms, of all those if statements that started back in verse 17.
So it would read smoothly, like, if you have all these privileges, and if you are a guide to the blind, then why do you teach others, but not yourself?
Right. That is the clean, logical way to read it. But the second way scholars handle this is much more visceral. The second option is to see verses 17 through 20 as an instance of anakalathon.
Anakalathon. That is a heavy rhetorical term. We need to break down how that actually functions in human speech.
Yeah, anakalathon is a literary and rhetorical term for a broken off, interrupted, or incomplete grammatical construction.
Okay.
It happens when a writer or a speaker starts a sentence, builds up a massive head of steam, gets so worked up or distracted by the intense emotion of the thought that they abandon the grammatical structure entirely. They don't finish the sentence, they just start firing direct accusations.
I can picture exactly what that looks like. You see it when someone is sputtering with righteous indignation. Paul starts listing all these privileges. If you have the law, if you boast in God, if you're a guide to the blind, and instead of finishing the sentence cleanly with it, then he just breaks the syntax entirely.
Right.
The grammar shatters because the hypocrisy is so glaring. He just starts yelling, you who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal?
The breakdown of the grammar perfectly reflects the intense accusatory emotion of the text. He keeps hammering them with questions. You who tell others not to commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples?
The hypocrisy being described here reminds me of a specific type of modern scandal. Think of a world-renowned fitness and diet guru.
Okay, I'm following.
This person sells millions of books. They post videos judging people for eating sugar. They built an entire empire on teaching the rules of health. They are a guide to the blind, just like the text says.
Yeah.
But then an investigative journalist finds out this guru is secretly living on fast food and soft drinks in their basement. The issue is not just their personal individual failure. When a hypocrite at that level gets caught, it ruins the brand. It destroys the credibility of the entire fitness program they were selling to the world.
But that analogy captures the dynamic perfectly, because the climax of this section in verse 24 proves that Paul is not just concerned with their personal moral failures, he is concerned with the collateral damage of their hypocrisy.
What does verse 24 say again?
Verse 24 delivers the crushing blow, "For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." And the translation notes indicate this is a direct quotation from the prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 52.5.
Wow. Relying on external religious instruction without internal obedience damages the reputation of God himself.
Yes.
The people outside the covenant community, the Gentiles, the people looking in, they see the hypocrisy of the people inside the community, and they don't just mock the hypocrites, they mock the God who supposedly gave the rules.
Right. Just like the fitness guru's failure makes people think the diet itself is a scam.
This brings us to the final, most radical section of our deep dive today, Romans 2.25 through 29. Because after dismantling their reliance on the written law and exposing the hypocrisy that leads to blasphemy, Paul targets the absolute pinnacle of external religious identity in the ancient world.
He really goes for the jugular to drive his final point home.
He targets circumcision. And to truly grasp the weight of what Paul is doing here, we have to understand the historical and cultural background of this practice. It was not just a minor medical procedure.
No, not at all. The translation notes provide essential historical context here. They trace the origin of male circumcision as a prescribed religious rite in the Old Testament back to Genesis 17.10 through 14.
This is where God establishes it as the sign of the covenant with Abraham.
Yes. And the notes quote the renowned scholar J.D.G. Dunn, who states that for Judaism in the first century, the weight of circumcision can hardly be overstated. Dunn calls it the single clearest distinguishing feature of the covenant people.
It was the ultimate boundary marker. You were in or you were out. It was the physical proof that you belonged to the chosen people.
Yeah.
But the cultural context in Rome around this time makes this even more intense. The notes bring up a fascinating historical suggestion by a scholar named J. Marcus.
Right. Marcus suggests that the Greek terms used here for circumcision peritomy and uncircumcision acrobustia were not just neutral clinical medical terms.
They were insults.
Exactly. Well, yes, they were highly charged, derogatory slogans used by Jews and Gentiles to describe their opponents in Rome. They were insults hurled across the cultural divide.
It is like playground name-calling, but with massive theological implications. You have two groups shouting slogans at each other, defining their entire worth by a physical marker.
Right.
And Paul steps into this incredibly toxic environment, takes the very slogans these groups are using as weapons, and flips them completely upside down.
Let's look at the great reversal he initiates in verses 25 and 26. He says, circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision.
And the notes mention that the contrast in verse 25 is much clearer and stronger in the Greek text than can be easily expressed in English translations.
Yes, the literal reading in verse 25 is, if you should be a transgressor of the law, is a conditional reality. And then verse 26 introduces the radical, unthinkable hypothetical scenario. So, if an uncircumcised man keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision?
The word keeks in verse 26 carries a lot of weight. The notes elaborate on the specific Greek word used there.
The Greek word is phulasso. The notes explain that in this specific context, phulash connotes the preservation of and devotion to an object, as well as practical obedience.
So it's not casual.
No, it is not just accidental blind compliance. It implies a deep, intentional, preserving devotion to the law's requirements by someone who does not possess the physical boundary-marking sign of the covenant.
And the reversal is finalized in verse 27. The uncircumcised person who physically keeps the law will actually stand in judgment over the circumcised person who breaks it.
Right.
The notes point out the literal Greek says the uncircumcision by nature. It highlights a specific preposition used in this verse. It says the judgment comes upon the one who breaks the law through the letter and circumcision, but the notes clarify that the preposition dia here seems to mean along with, or though provided with, the literal letter and the physical mark.
The point he is making is absolutely devastating to religious pride. You can be provided with the literal written letter of the ancient law, and you can be provided with the physical mark of covenant circumcision, and you can still be a total transgressor.
Wow.
The physical letter and the physical mark mean absolutely nothing without the internal obedience of the heart.
Which brings us to the core issue, literally, the heart of the matter. Verse 28 says, a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision something outward and physical.
And verse 29 gives the true hidden marks of belonging. But a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart.
Circumcision is of the heart. It sounds like a radical new Christian idea, but it is actually not a New Testament invention at all.
No, it really isn't.
The translation notes link this phrase back to massive Old Testament precedents. They list Leviticus 26.41, Deuteronomy 10.1c, Jeremiah 4.4, and Ezekiel 44.9.
The ancient prophets have been crying out for this internal reality for centuries. The physical marks were always supposed to represent a heart that was soft and devoted to God, not a hard heart hiding behind a ritual.
And the final phrase of verse 29 draws a sharp contrast between the spirit and the literal letter. It says, this circumcision of the heart is by the spirit, not by the written code.
Now, there is an ongoing scholarly debate on how to translate that specific phrase. The Greek is pneumati.
Okay, what are the options?
The notes clarify that some scholars do not take this as a direct reference to the Holy Spirit to the Trinity. Instead, they translate the grammar to mean that true circumcision is spiritual and not literal in its nature.
Got it.
But regardless of which side of that specific grammatical debate you land on, the functional contrast is clear. The physical, literal letter, the external marker you can show off to other people, is entirely insufficient for justification.
And what is the result of this internal spiritual reality? The text ends by saying such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God.
The translation notes indicate the Greek sentence structure is very complex here, literally saying whose praise, but the theological point is undeniable.
Yeah, true praise, true vindication in that courtroom we talked about at the beginning comes from God's internal evaluation of the heart.
Not from the external approval of other people recognizing your religious affiliations and titles.
It is a complete demolition of religious pride. The playing field is entirely leveled. The text leaves zero room for anyone to boast in their external advantages.
The logic is inescapable. No one gets a pass based on their heritage or their vocabulary.
So let's bring this all together. We started with scholars arguing over whether Paul was confused or setting a trap. We looked into the mechanics of that trap, evaluating the hypothetical standard of perfect works, and we saw how it functions as a mirror, not a straw man.
Right.
We saw how the conscience acts as an internal courtroom for those without the written rules. And finally, we saw that external markers, religious privileges, and written codes offer zero shelter from judgment if the heart remains hard and the actions do not match the profession.
The gavel falls, and the judge realizes they are the one on trial.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought based on this text. If having the correct doctrines, the best theological instructions, and the right external affiliations actually increases your culpability when your actions do not match your words, what hidden derogatory slogans are you relying on today to prove you are on the right side of the line while ignoring the actual condition of your own heart? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.